All right. Thank you for joining us once again for the Chamber's monthly luncheon online. It's September, which is a little bit crazy to me right now. We're getting ready for schools to start. We're getting ready for fall. A lot of things have changed, and a lot of things are exciting. So I'm going to start off our virtual luncheon by doing a little bit of announcements, letting folks know what's happening, and then I am going to be joined in conversation with Representative Drazan to talk a little bit about what's happening at the state legislature and what's happening around the state, and get you guys some answers to some of the questions that have been submitted to us. So to open it up, I just want to start by thanking our presidential level sponsor, DirectLink, as always. Their generosity helps with chamber programming throughout the year, and they're a great community partner, helping all kinds of organizations, sports, schools, businesses, etc. So thank you to DirectLink. Also, in this time, it's a little crazy, and I am lucky enough to have the guidance of a board of directors. And so I would like to thank my board of directors for their patience, their insight, their creativity, their stick-to-itiveness, their endurance in helping guide the chamber during this time. So we'll begin with Terry Giesick, the president of the board from Gustafson Insurance and Frontier Golf Course. Our first vice president, Jim Davis, the Canby Fire Chief from Canby Fire District. Our second vice president, Tyler Nizer from Clackamas County Fairgrounds and Event Center. Our secretary treasurer, Diane Harbeck from Better Homes and Gardens Realty Partners. Tina Schimpf from Hope Village. Joel Cutsforth from Cutsforth Market. George Martinez from U.S. Bank. Mallory Gwynn from Gwynn's Coffee House. Mace Peevler from Wilson Construction, and our currently serving past president, Carrie Olin from Promotional Strategies. So once again, my thanks to the board for their presence in helping me navigate COVID and our current situation. So September is going to be interesting. We're kind of turning a corner. It dawned on us at the chamber that we are very, very close to Marion County, which is in phase 2. And that is giving us a little bit of wiggle room to restart some programming. And so we're starting here in September. So the first thing that's very exciting is that the Canby Employment Expo 2020 is looking good. On Tuesday, September 22nd, from noon to 5 p.m., we'll be hosting the expo outdoors at Aurora Colony Vineyards. I have a walkthrough of the grounds on Thursday for the final event verification, but I don't have a lot of concerns there. So look forward to that announcement, and hopefully we will be able to get job seekers and employers met up together in a safe outdoor environment and maybe get some folks back to work and plug some of those vacancies within our small business community. So look forward to that announcement coming later this week. We also are restarting face-to-face networking. Our first event is Thursday, September 10th from 8 to 9 a.m. We're going to be at Arlene Cuisine, a local caterer, and she has this lovely outdoor dining space on her property. And so we'll be meeting outside at Arlene Cuisine on the 10th. And so we're going to be limiting attendance. Event registration is free. You can find that on the event calendar at the chamber website. We're going to limit the number of folks. We're going to be wearing masks if we cannot maintain 6 feet of social distance, but we're going to be getting together and, being people in the same room, which is going to be a nice change of pace. We also have the golf tournament on September 17th at Willamette Valley Country Club. We're on a team waiting list, but we do have a couple of openings for tee sponsorships. So if you want your company represented at that event, it's a full field. In terms of players. So if you want your company represented, reach out and we'll get you hooked up. Another big announcement, the new drive-in movie theater is open. After much hard work and creativity on the part of Clackamas County Fairgrounds and Event Center, this new attraction is open. I'd like to give special thanks to our board member, Tyler Nizer from the Fairgrounds, and the executive director, Lori Bothwell, as well as the Fair Board for putting together this feature and thinking outside the box. In addition, I'd like to thank the businesses who I dealt with in helping to sponsor this project, and that includes Wilson Construction and our board member, Mace Peevler, and one of our newest members, Emmerich Construction, and its leader, Corey Lohman, for their hand in making this project happen. Finally, Canby Cinemas and my oldest friend, Jeremy Longstreet, for their critical advice and willingness to partner on this project. It really took a village to make this all happen. And so there was a lot of hands, a lot of work, a lot of charity, a lot of donations to bring this resource to the community to provide families a place to go. So we're very excited about that. And, couple of announcements as well. So we are opening ad sales for the Canby Roadmap. This is the #1 requested resource from the Chamber of Commerce. We print 5,000 each time we make the map, and the last time we did that was 2018, and we're almost out. So about 2,500 maps are given out each year. There's advertising space available. The last time the actual roadmap itself was updated was 2015. So lots of new roads, lots of new developments and construction going on, so we want to update that resource. So reach out to the Chamber if you're interested in that. And then starting later this week, it is Scarecrow Contest time. Shannon Ali from Hot Rod DreamWorks just reached out, and registration will start later this week for the Scarecrow Contest. With COVID and whatnot happening, it's always nice to have kind of things to do around the community, and driving around or walking around and looking at the scarecrows, providing outdoor entertainment for our families, a way to get out and get moving and get fresh air is always welcome. And it does a lot for our downtown. So if you'd like, your business, your club, your organization would like to participate in that, get a hold of Shannon Ali from Hot Rod DreamWorks. And so that is, with all of that said, I'd like to welcome Representative Christine Drazan back to our monthly luncheon series. Representative Drazan has been very busy this year with all of her regular legislative duties, her position as minority leader, and handling all of the necessary commitments that have arisen as a result of COVID-19 and the multiple special sessions and committee work that she's been asked to participate in. We're very grateful to have her representing our district during these challenging times, but also grateful for her willingness to be present in the community throughout this process and for making herself available to talk to us again today. So welcome, Christine.
Thank you for doing this. So I was just having this flashback to the last time we sat socially distanced here.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was kind of at the beginning of all of this COVID stuff.
Yeah.
So, so much has changed, and yet so much has remained the same.
Right.
It's great to be here.
I believe that was our April luncheon.
Yeah.
And April feels like a millennia ago. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so much unknown.
Right. So we're going to kind of dive right in. We have a lot to cover. But is there anything in terms of just kind of opening remarks that you'd like to?
So, I know we have a lot of questions from chamber members, and I want to get right to that. But I just want to say quickly, I could not be more excited that there's going to be a movie theater, and that the Scarecrow Contest is back, and that things are starting to feel like we're all navigating this in a way that's starting to feel more like community again. Right. So I just loved all the updates. It's encouraging.
Well, and this last weekend, I volunteered at the car show, the Cuts Forest Cruisin'.
Isn't that great? Drive-through?
Yeah, and so I worked the registration table for the cars and got to see that whole process. And once I left there, I went to meet my family to have lunch. And in that process, I drove by the Canby Farmers Market.
Yep.
Which is expanded now to its second block.
Going strong. Yep.
And between leaving the car show and that kind of event and that feeling of community and whatnot, and then driving by the farmers market and seeing people out in the street, it felt like
real,
normal, real
felt
community.
Like summer.
Yeah,
a little bit.
Yeah, very much so. Okay. That's exactly what I told my family.
So I went to the Canby Farmers Market a few weeks ago, and I'm going to admit I bought yard Yahtzee.
Oh, nice.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to say it's not quite the same, but I love the idea.
Yes. Yeah. Super funny. I just bought inflatable dice this morning.
See?
For
I don't know.
rolling out in the yard.
Because now we're at home.
Right. Right. You pass the time how you can.
You do what you have to do.
Right. Exactly. So again, thank you. We'll jump right in. Many of these questions have come from chamber members that have sent them in. So when I speak the I,
Yes.
it doesn't always
Yes.
necessarily mean me. I just took it from the email. So first question. While I understand that Governor Brown believes she is acting in the best interests of Oregonians by issuing the COVID emergency orders, does it seem she has exceeded her authority? Thoughts?
Yeah, this is a comment I get a lot in my office. And the issue at play is not whether or not we should all do everything we can in response to doctors' recommendations for whether or not we wear masks and maintain social distance. It's the actions that the governor has taken that have been specific to our businesses and our schools and other entities for whether or not they're allowed to open and when they're allowed to open. And from all of the legal activity around the governor's executive orders, I can say that none of those have succeeded yet, which means that from a legal perspective, so far anyway, the courts have determined that the governor continues to operate within her authority.
Yeah.
Whether people like it or don't like it, it appears that the courts so far have determined that she is within her authority. One of the issues that I continue to bring up to her is the areas where there's wiggle room for how she approaches this. So even though she has the authority,
Right.
the question becomes, how does she exercise it?
Right.
And that's where I think it's really important that we provide input, accountability, and encourage her to show restraint.
Yeah.
And to do the thing that keeps people safe and be mindful of the unintended long-term consequences for that.
Right.
And there will be. We know there will
Right.
be. So the kids that are second graders going into the third grade now or kindergartners going into the first grade, what will their lives look like in 5 years from now?
Yes.
Will they have the same sort of social development? How will their study skills be? How will they be academically when we're back in the classroom? And the same thing goes for families right now. So for families that have completely depleted all of their savings that
Right.
might have taken 5 or 10 years to accumulate, how long will it take them, even if they have their unemployment insurance checks now? What will it look like for them to be able to be stable again? And how does that affect families?
Right.
How does it affect kids? How does it affect their willingness to start a new business and to do something that's higher risk? Like in normal times, you look at those risks in it, and you look at whether or not you can get bridge financing, and whether or not there's whether or not you can afford rent, and what some of your projections are for revenues. And now there's this question of, if we're shut down, how do I sustain? How do I restock inventory? How do I plan? And from that perspective, I talk to the governor on a pretty regular basis, and I am kind of unrelenting on this question of restraint and being consistent and communicating as much as she possibly can. When I talk with her and we have conversations about what my concerns are on behalf of my district, I'm always asking her, so are you going to make an announcement later? What are you working on? Is there something that you want to share with me?
Right.
Because she is active in a lot of different categories right now. And I want to be able to, in that moment, communicate on behalf of my district and on behalf of the rest of the folks in the state that aren't talking to her right then, and be able to say whatever she needs to hear,
Yeah.
that maybe her advisors and her circle might not be offering up for her.
Yeah.
So-
if you pull this lever
Yeah,
in whatever category she's
Whatever
working
that might be.
across, right?
yeah.
It has.
So this last conversation ranged all over the map, but one of the things we talked about was swimming.
Yeah.
Because there's some word on the street that some people are swimming in Lake Oswego, but they're not swimming in Canby. So what about that? How does that happen?
Right.
And so, you can kind of get into the weeds. Well, was it a public pool? Is it a community pool? Well, we're all phase one because we're tied to Multnomah County.
Right.
And so, well, what about swim teams? Can swim teams start again?
Right.
It's safe in the pool. It's not social. You can socially distant. You know who's there.
Right.
You can do all the health
It's
stuff.
not just free play within
It's
the
not
pool.
public.
It's in lanes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, having that conversation with the governor. When can swim teams restart?
Mm-hmm.
We're at the end of summer. So if you shut down community pools, people go to the rivers.
Yep.
Where there's even less ability to manage, navigate, and track.
Yeah.
And so everything has a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
Everything, if you do this, people will respond this way.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the conversations we have, and that was a long answer to that question. I do believe she's operating within her authority. I do believe she should show a little bit more restraint as she does that.
Right.
And I do view it as my role to communicate as much as I can in the categories that I get the sense she might not be hearing from people.
Yeah. Good. So you kind of actually touched on this point a little bit in that answer, but how can we get Clackamas County out from being tied to Multnomah County and Washington County? The economic impact to our region continues to increase, even as our county numbers continue to improve. Is there any conversation surrounding Clackamas County getting unshackled from the Tri-County region?
Lord have mercy, I want us to be unshackled. So
Yeah.
I talk to her about this every single time we talk. There is no basis for Clackamas County to be tied to Multnomah County based on the data.
Yeah.
The data does not say that we are equivalent for how
Right.
our communities are managing COVID right now. And not only that, but in the Federal CARES Act, Multnomah County, Washington County, and the city of Portland got direct funding from the federal government.
Exactly.
So we are tied to two jurisdictions that are able to manage COVID independent of the state because they have their own resources.
Right.
Clackamas County doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Clackamas County has to spend money outright, directly, and then they can request reimbursement and hope that it was eligible. And so when we're stuck in phase one and we're tied to counties that have much higher numbers than we do, and by the way, we don't even have direct resources to be able to subsidize businesses that are hobbling along at phase one standards,
Yeah.
and support families that are also being responsive to those kinds of requirements in phase one. It's a different experience in Clackamas County.
Yeah.
So I
have
continue to ask her.
I have chamber counterparts in Washington County where they've been able to start these small
Yep.
small business centers based on the CARES funding that they've been able to receive. They're able to staff and provide services to small
Yeah.
business. But lacking that funding in Clackamas County, we aren't afforded that same opportunity.
And you could do it, but you'd have to find the money first,
Right.
launch it,
Mhm.
and then hope that the reimbursement was quick,
Right.
adequate, full. And so it's just a very different position to be in.
Yeah.
And so the numbers and the data don't justify tying us to the metro, to specifically Multnomah County. And the rest of the state operates for the most part on a county-by-county basis.
Right.
Our public health apparatus is at a county level. It makes sense to look at our numbers at a county level.
Yep.
And so I keep encouraging her to reconsider that.
Okay.
So far, no bueno.
Right.
No luck.
Okay.
We will keep trying, though.
I will say I largely anticipated that as the answer. Okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, no.
I will not give up.
That I appreciate. We're going to switch gears a little bit. This is really kind of a broad question. Kind of take this as you will. Thoughts and prospects of reopening schools this fall.
So this one is an interesting issue because what we look at and think about when we talk about schools becomes it's a little bit of a workforce issue, and it's an education issue, and it's a health issue, and an economic issue certainly for families.
Family issue.
Yes.
Childcare issue.
Going back to work, your kid is at home learning. And so this is a big one. The path for reopening schools at this time, the standards the governor has set are extraordinary. She has said that we should have around 60 new COVID cases a day for her to consider. And additionally, there's like the 5%, and there's
Right.
like all kinds of, there's a couple
Cases
of
per 100,000.
Yes.
And yes.
So there's some other metrics. And the statewide cases of like the 5% per 100,000, the Oregon Health Authority, as I understand it, believes that we're really close to meeting that, and then that's not unrealistic. The 60-ish cases a day is a long ways from where we are now in the 200 range. And the question for me, I had a conversation after the governor made this announcement, and suddenly school was going to be 200 days out before it could reopen.
Right.
Instead of sort of being county by county.
April, I think, was thrown out there at
right?
one point.
Yeah, which is the, seniors, anyway, all of our kiddos.
Yes.
That is kind of spring. That's not really fall at that point. And so I had a quick conversation with the director of the Oregon Health Authority to better understand why they chose those metrics. And the other thing I wanted to understand is when you say 60 cases a day, it used to be confirmed cases for people who had been tested. And you got a test if you showed symptoms, and it was part of how they managed and made sure that the hospitals didn't get overwhelmed.
Right.
And so you'd be tested if you were kind of on a path to potential hospitalization or needing medical care. Now that's not the case. Tests are more widely available. And so now the number of cases are now also not just confirmed, but also presumptive cases.
Wow.
And it's the presumptive cases that's built into that I was the most concerned about. My original understanding of presumptive cases was if you showed symptoms that were COVID-like, which, as we all know, sore throat, cough, fever.
Loss of taste, smell.
Yeah, and it can be any one of those things.
Right.
Alone, it could look a little bit like the allergies, could look a little bit like a cold, and so I was concerned that people presenting with any of those were being counted into our numbers, and my concern was, well, we're coming up on flu season. How will people distinguish if they're not requiring testing and doing only confirmed cases? If they're also doing presumptive cases, how will we ever hit that metric?
Yeah. And
his response to me was a little bit helpful. I still have concerns, but this makes a little bit more sense as long as it's actually, they're sticking to this, I hope, is that you only become a presumptive case if you had extended exposure to someone who was confirmed. So if a member of your family is in that number and tested positive, or someone at your workplace tested positive, and then you show symptoms, and it sounded like the expectation was then at some point you get tested. Between the time you show symptoms and you're tested, they consider you a presumptive case.
Okay. But it seems like the linchpin of that is to the contact tracing.
Yeah.
That there is a case of origin.
Yeah, that they can identify.
Previous to showing symptoms. Okay.
And close contact.
Yeah.
So I was at the same, whatever.
Restaurant.
Not passing ships in the night.
Yeah.
Close contact.
Okay.
And there has been a lot of conversation about counting and data and what's in these numbers, and it's different for each area, and it seems a little bit nebulous sometimes for how strict these numbers really get counted. There's conversations about people who are counted as COVID positive and it's postmortem, where it's an elderly person and they didn't necessarily know that they had COVID, but after the fact it's a part now of that process, and they determine if they had COVID, and then they're counted in the count. And so some of these issues, I when I was talking to the Oregon Health Authority director, I said, at some point when you get close enough, these details matter. Whether or not you count people that are in the community and could contribute to community spread, or if they are in congregate care, or if they are incarcerated.
Right.
Like if you have cases in a prison, are those counted towards our numbers? If you have cases in congregate care where the person actually is not out in the community, do those count towards our numbers? How does presumptive cases work? Like it begins to really, really matter.
Yeah.
We won't hit that unless we fully understand what it is we're shooting for. And I would like to also say that's like a serious, serious moving of the goalposts.
Yeah.
When we started all this, and it was we don't want to overwhelm our hospital system and we want to protect our most vulnerable.
Yep.
And now we are really, truly trying to eradicate COVID from our population before there is necessarily treatment or a vaccine. That's a high bar.
Right.
That's a high bar. And so I have some concerns about how the goalposts have moved through this entire process. And part of my conversations with the governor, I'm always maybe a little bit too candid with her. But my concern is always this can't be a political decision.
Right.
These have to be based on doctor recommendations. This has to be based on public health. This can't be because you have a political constituency that wants you to make a particular decision here.
Right.
The approach needs to be even-handed. And it needs to be consistent so that we can work together to achieve these goals because we know how it's impacting public health.
Right.
And if achieving the goals isn't to broadly benefit a public health goal that we all agree with, it's going to be hard to have Oregonians be willing to do it. And then that puts all the pressure on businesses and regulated entities to really shoulder the burden for us to get from, 200 plus cases down to 50 or 60.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
Right.
So for me, it was tough.
So many people are trying to access data and information from home, from their offices of the businesses that they own and whatnot. And like you said, where's the good info,
Yeah.
right? Where's the good place to look in terms of what is going to be actionable in terms of removing regulation, whether it be to business or to schools and that becomes difficult to source.
Yeah, it does, and that's been part of the challenge when this is done through executive orders rather than a more traditional public process. Has been how are you making these decisions? Like, who are you talking to?
Yeah.
And how are you deciding? Like, that's been part of the challenge. I would say that the Oregon Health Authority has been posting. I mean, everybody sees the daily updates.
Yes.
Everybody gets, you can sign up for that stuff and get that stuff pushed out to you.
Right. As we do.
As we all do. But what you don't see is when those numbers change, and at one point in the process they were confirmed cases because people had been tested and they tested positive, and then they changed to confirmed plus presumptive. It's not like they put a big red flag out there and said we're no longer apples to apples. We've now gone apples and oranges, and you guys should look at these numbers a little differently.
Right.
Like when you see a spike in cases, all of a sudden it really does mean that some of the metrics have changed.
Yeah.
And so that's really important for them to share.
Yeah.
It's really important, just draw a little line in the graph and say from this point on, we revised our guidelines in response to CDC recommendations or whatever it was.
Asterisks here.
Little notes.
Right. Yeah.
We're now in a different world. You can't look at these the same.
Yeah.
And that's not always what they do.
Yeah.
And so that does make it hard to navigate and understand really what we're going for. But I mean, Clackamas County in particular is doing well. I mean, managing and doing. I mean, we're at a place where under any other circumstances we would certainly be in phase 2.
Yes.
And so I look forward to the day that we are unshackled, as you said, from Multnomah County and are allowed to progress independently as a county, which I think is the right decision.
Well, and I think it's the character of our county to be independent.
Yep.
Knowing my population of members and just my family and my friends, that independent streak is definitely part of our character as a region.
Yeah.
So I think it becomes additionally troublesome to us to not
shackled.
be.
Well, and there's also this other question. I think at some point people start to feel like there's like a lack of mutual respect. You look across the table and you say, you don't think I'm going to do what's right by my neighbors? You just think I'm a bad person right now?
Right.
Like if you give me some guidance and
it's common sense.
And it's common sense and
achievable.
I'm going to do the right thing.
Right.
So let's begin to let people be responsive to that.
Yeah. So to circle back around,
yes.
Is there anything in addition to schools that comes out of our analysis of data and data sources and where it comes from?
So the school stuff, the last part of the school stuff, I should say, is that the governor's press conference, I believe, to your point, said April, 200 days.
Yeah.
And then that follow-up conversation that I am trying to better understand those numbers because I think they're really troubling and not helpful to students. I really don't think there are very many kids that benefit as a whole from being in that environment for another year like this.
Yeah.
The other information was, well, hey, maybe we can get this done in as quickly as 6 to 8 weeks. And how that happens and why that was a number that has also being bandied about is part of the problem.
Right.
Because it was, well, we probably could get it done that quickly.
Yeah, ish.
Yeah, okay, if that's the case, why did we ever talk about 200 days?
Right.
And if that's the case, does it require that you Jimmy rig the numbers? Or does that require you crack down on businesses? Or you're going to visit people at family reunions? Or, like, how do you get there?
Right.
And if it is that easy to get there, why are you trying to scare the heebie-jeebies out of people and tell them it's 200 days?
Yeah.
And so that is the political part that I kind of recoil against and say, just be straight. Oregonians can take it.
Yeah.
Be straight with them. Don't try to scare them. Don't try to manipulate them. Just be as consistent as you possibly can. Be as clear as you possibly can.
Yep.
And then let us know how things are going.
Right.
But 200 days in one conversation down to 6 to 8 weeks in another conversation is, those aren't even in the same universe for planning.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
it seems a little bit arbitrary to me.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. I just wanted to make sure we closed the loop.
That's the close of the loop right
that's
there.
the close. Okay. All right, so we're going to move on to kind of a next set of questions. These will deal more with kind of protests, law enforcement, and other issues. This is a member question. There are a lot of LC drafts which involve law enforcement, which appear to be in response to the Portland riots and protests. Rather than Portland City Council carrying these bills to implement within city limits, these are at the state level. What are the possibilities that these bills being voted into law, and what sort of short-term and long-term impacts would we likely see statewide if bills are passed?
So we have passed quite a few bills related to law enforcement reform, accountability. In the first special session, there was a whole suite of bills. In the second, we had one, but it was more of an omnibus bill. So to that person's point, the challenges that we are seeing and the pressure we're seeing really relate to urban policing, much more so than suburban and small town policing. Rural police force. I mean, and so their point is well taken, that if those are the challenges and those are the communities that they feel like they need additional retraining, additional standards, new expectations for accountability, why isn't this just Portland City Council? And I think the short political answer to that is I think Portland City Council would probably abandon their police force than just fix them. But the longer, probably fairer answer is that we always want to work in every category of public service and provide the highest quality service to citizens. And in the law enforcement community, if you ever talk to anybody that's in the law enforcement community, they want that too.
Yes.
And they want to root out the bad apples, and they want to have a relationship with their community where they're in service to their community's needs. And so
and they want clear and effective policy that dictates how they navigate their own communities as they police as well.
Yeah, for their safety too. And so the legislation that was passed in the first special session was law enforcement was at the table, and there was a negotiated agreement for the approach on the suite of bills that were passed.
Okay.
And frankly, the last two special sessions were so needed for police accountability measures for a couple of reasons. Oregon had not updated its statutes around police accountability since the 70s.
Oh, wow.
And I know that's hard to imagine, but what law enforcement had been doing, as I understand it, was changing their training practices and their policies in response to court cases. And so they were just kind of setting the statutes to the side and saying, we're going to meet the standards required in the courts for what is permissible for restraints, use of force, all of those kinds of things. They were depending on court cases. which was a much higher standard than our statutes were. And so our statutes had now been updated. They've been modernized to reflect the requirements that police forces across the state were already training to. And now there's consistency. And now that standard isn't up to individual law enforcement agencies to adopt, it's in statute. And so I think that you can expect, from Oregon at least, we have had a very forward-thinking relationship with law enforcement for a long time. We have had for quite some time law enforcement that brings social workers on mental health checks, and we have partnerships in the community to provide supports that have behavioral health challenges. And so specifically Clackamas County has, like best in class supports to people who are facing behavioral health challenges and need recovery access, like sustained support for recovery. And that work is now kind of getting acknowledged in a way that is appropriate to them. And I think that it's important that we communicate that out to our communities better, so that they understand that the values of the police force continue to be to support communities. And so we have a committee. There's always a committee and a task force for all these things.
Yes.
And that committee's been charged with developing any additional recommendations that might be needed for the long session in 2021. Now, again, for me, what's important here is that they make room at the table for law enforcement to sit down with people that have concerns about what policing has looked like, and that what they move forward with in the future continues to be something that can be operationalized by law enforcement and can allow them to continue to fulfill their mission of keeping communities safe while respecting the rights of individuals, to exercise their First Amendment rights, or whatever that issue might be. There has to be that balance. And so I hope that will continue. So far, that's how they've operated in this first 2 sessions, but I would expect more recommendations from that committee.
Okay. So, I mean, that's good. That's good to kind of know the kind of through line of that is that what has passed already, modernization and updates to kind of accepted community standards as of this point, but that it's not an end point to the conversation. The conversation continues, and we'll see what kind of happens in next steps through this committee work and the long session.
But they do need to be sure that they are not creating policing standards statewide that are very specifically oriented towards an urban environment. Right. That's super important. Like, you can't treat every small town like it's downtown Portland. So. Well,
I think that's much of the challenge for the legislature in all categories of lawmaking. Is that we do have a state that is geographically, demographically diverse, and the needs range across the big spectrum, and so it's very hard.
One size does not fit all, almost ever.
Interesting. Okay. Kind of a follow-up on this one. Is there anything that the legislature can do to address the civil unrest in Portland and Eugene?
I would say that the legislature has done a lot to be responsive to this moment in history. But when it comes to the civil unrest in some of our communities, I think that some of that is in response to a national conversation that we're having right now, and that's engagement locally in response to things that might not be as updated in other towns and other communities across the nation.
Practices and
I mean, not everybody operates the way we do here in Oregon for how community policing happens, and so I think that that the legislature always has to be responsive to the needs of Oregonians, but I also think on the other side of that, sometimes Oregonians just need to say what they need to say, and the legislature isn't always the right venue to resolve all of the challenges that people feel our nation faces. And so, we have a role, and it's right here, but it's not necessarily all the way up here. And so I think that the civil unrest feels like some of it is not necessarily about local issues all the time.
But a local expression of a national, broader
Yep.
issue, and that maybe is what we're facing and seeing some of these situations in our more urban areas.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. State funding issues. And so bear with me here. This one's a long one.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. I've had the pleasure of sharing the podium with you at our community updates, and I've heard you mention on multiple occasions the idea that funding reflects, quote, reflects our priorities. With that in mind, I'd like to maybe chat about the second special session and dig in a little bit to the changes made in that session and discuss what we can learn about the legislature's priorities in terms of the actions taken. For example, the legislature voted to pull $400 million from the Education Stability Fund to keep the state school fund whole, and voted to trim another $400 million from lottery and general fund programs. On balance, the legislature opted to keep Oregon's $9 billion K-12 budget unharmed and worked to plug the $1 billion shortfall using the aforementioned cuts and other budget maneuvers, including reshuffling of expenses and sweeps of dedicated funds. Could you summarize, I won't ask you to dig too deep, but could you summarize for us what the reshuffling of expenses looked like and what the sweeps of dedicated funds meant?
Yes. The reshuffling of funds had some to do with taking vacancy savings. So if a position was unfilled, they, instead of holding money in the budget for those positions, they swept it back to help rebalance. They reduced services and supplies. They reduced travel budgets, administrative expenses. That was sort of the low-hanging fruit.
Okay.
And in addition to that, they also, I say they, but it was the legislative body, there was also improvements in areas like debt service. I mean, cost for borrowing has gone down, so there were savings there from what was originally anticipated. They swept that money aside, applied it towards the budget deficit, and then there was a fund that was set aside. I'm going to just give one very specific example for school districts to be able to create what are called secondary accounts for their unfunded PERS liability. So PERS is the Public Employee Retirement System, and for employees that have retired or left the system, of course the school district still has an obligation for those employees to continue to pay for their retirement. And the state recognized that local governments and schools in particular, were having a hard time meeting that obligation, and it was kind of eating into their general fund.
Right.
And
operations
budget. get impacted when you have to cut off the top to cover this obligation that you have.
Right.
So they set aside kind of matching funds. So if schools created a fund that was a secondary fund towards PERS, then the state would match some of those dollars and help them draw down their debt. Well, for whatever reason, it was not a good fit for school districts, and they didn't take advantage of that opportunity. So there was a pot of money sitting there, and so it was swept back to help rebalance the budget. That's one example of a sweep.
Okay.
And when there's ending funds sitting in various agencies, they will sweep that back in to help rebalance.
Okay.
And so that was some of the examples. It is kind of budgetary hocus pocus, because it's all general fund dollars, it's all our tax dollars. It's just sitting in different pots throughout government.
It had been dedicated.
And it had been dedicated,
it's kind of,
but not spent.
Right.
And so they kind of brought it back, and swept all that back in to help us rebalance. Constitutionally, we have to stay in balance.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to get there in this first round of cuts, because we had such a substantial ending fund balance remaining at the end of the 19 session that wasn't touched in the 20 session. And we had reserve funds. We had the Education Stability Fund, which, as you mentioned, the legislature tapped about half of that to keep schools whole. So when you talk about priorities, in this session, a priority was to support schools.
Yes.
And a secondary priority was to do as little harm as possible. And that's how you get administrative savings, fund sweeps. You try to find places where you're not impacting programs for Oregonians. Now,
sounds like a one-time trick, though.
One time. That money's not going to be there next time.
Right.
And so we're anticipating a $5 billion COLE, which is a lot for Oregon, in the next long session. that's going to be real cuts. I mean, that is going to, I shouldn't say
Program.
cuts. That will change what services Oregonians receive.
Yeah.
I think you shouldn't look at it as like a cut, a program cut. You should say, there is a whole lot that government does. This is going to be an opportunity for government, for us to say as a state, pardon me, as a state, I'm talking too much. What are the core services? What's the safety net? What's the scope of what we must do right now? And let's make sure we do that. My approach to schools was I consider that to be core services, constitutionally mandated, provide schools, you know. And at a state level, we have to have a balanced budget. We have to maintain a National Guard. We have to have schools for our kids. That's kind of the extent of the proactive stuff that was in our original Constitution that we have to do. And so for me, that was absolutely a priority. The interesting thing, though, about that amount is that it assumes now that we've invested that money, we all are crossing our fingers and hoping for the best, that means our kids will get a quality education out of this new model.
Right.
Whatever it looks like, whether or not you're hybrid, whether or not you are at-home learning or traditional online charter, whatever it is, we really, really, really need it to work. We've fully funded it. We haven't said, you know, there's not brick and mortar buildings anymore. We're going to take some cost savings there. We haven't asked districts to report out to us where their cost savings might be with furlough days or reduced school hours or our kids are going to go 4 days instead of 5 with teacher support.
Right.
But so we're not asking the districts to do any of that rebalance for us. The legislature has said we committed $9 billion. Here's $9 billion. Now, as parents, community members, and students, we have to make the most of that. We have to get the best possible education for our kiddos that we can in the school year, whether or not they're back in school in 8 weeks or whether or not they're back in school in 200 days. Whatever range in between it looks like, we need them to be students. Like grades, attendance, progress, student learning, the whole deal. We need it.
Yep.
And so for me personally, that was an absolute priority, that we give the opportunity for our schools to succeed. And now we need our kids to learn.
Yeah.
And so that was really important.
Because you don't want to doubly challenge them to where, okay,
they're doing this
do
new
a new
thing.
model.
Yes.
Do
it for less.
And do it for less.
Yeah.
Right.
Like
That's
go ahead and
tough.
like work the magic with the money.
Right.
And work the magic with the kiddos.
Yeah.
And I have no idea how this is going to go.
Right.
None of us know how this is going to go.
Right.
But it is also an opportunity moving forward to say, whatever we learn from this, whatever we glean from this for our kids, if there is something about this new universe we're operating in that can help us strengthen learning and control costs and support more kids moving forward, when we're on the other side of this, we shouldn't toss it aside.
Right.
We should take from this whatever we can, because we've invested in this new system. So can this new system help buoy and support students that weren't well served by the brick and mortar in the first place? I mean, we had the lowest graduation rates in the nation to start with.
Yeah.
And so maybe there's some silver lining here.
Yeah.
Maybe this is going to serve kids differently, and we'll figure out whether or not some kids can benefit from having this moving forward.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Hoping for the best, like this. All of us are.
Yeah. I mean, I taught online for 8 years at the community college and university level.
Yeah.
And they are being having to shoulder a big challenge.
Yeah.
And of course, I support them and want the best outcomes for them. And there are certain students who will thrive.
Yeah.
But in the same way that not all students thrive in the brick and mortar, not all students will thrive here. And so, like you said, taking these lessons and maybe weaving models together when we can come out the backside of this, like hopefully that is the silver lining, that we actually maybe understand the modern student better.
Yeah.
And what works and what doesn't, and techniques and whatnot. So,
Yep. My house, I had 3 kiddos go through this in the spring, a freshman in college, and then somebody finishing out their 7th grade year and finishing out their sophomore year. And each kid responded differently to this environment at different phases. And I would imagine that families across Oregon, when you throw in the mix of parents and what they can dedicate to this, and I'm speaking for myself right now, it's hard.
Right.
And on top of your kids' personalities and their learning styles and all of those things, there's no doubt that having a system that engages students more with tutors and teachers and, kind of connects with them, because it was like this at our house.
Yeah.
And they
Same.
were doing great when they were doing great, but
Right.
boy, when they hit that ditch, it was like, hello, come
Right.
back to me. Like, we have to keep going. The school year's not over.
Right.
So I'm hoping for the best, but I know it's going to be a challenge for our
Yeah.
families and our students.
But we are Oregonians. We'll face it.
We'll get there.
Conquer it. We'll make it happen. Okay. Additionally, kind of within funding issues, $35 million in one-time payments were awarded to individuals who waited in lines at 8 small credit unions or banks in Oregon. And the vetting process were a few questions using the honor system. There are many people in situations of great need, while there are plenty of people who worked the system and took advantage of the grants due to the extremely easy application process. What checks and balances were put into place, if any, and what recourse does the state have to hold abusers of the grants accountable?
Yeah, this is a huge issue. So much money came into the state through the CARES Act,
Yeah.
and it all had to be spent by the end of the year. And so we have this need to get the money out the door quickly, and also spend it appropriately,
Right.
get it to the right people at the right time. And the opportunity for fraud and abuse is massive. And so the challenge that we have with that is that getting the money back is going to end up not being the responsibility of the individual necessarily. It'll be the state.
Yeah.
And so if it's found that people access that money fraudulently, the state will be the one that has to repay the federal government. And in tight budget scenarios facing a $5 billion shortfall, it's incumbent on the state to make sure that that money did not go to people who should not have received it.
Yeah.
And the honor system only works with people who are willing to be honorable in the system. And I would expect that that we will have some challenges on the other side of this. I've met with the Secretary of State's office, and they are responsible for audits. And I've had lengthy conversations with them about their approach to auditing the CARES Act funding and the decisions that have been made at a legislative level for how that money gets spent. And they have a very robust auditing function, and they're preparing to do a forensic dive into how this money goes out the door.
Okay.
And so while that isn't preventative, I mean,
What's done is done.
what's done is done. And you have to hope that people who needed the money got it,
Yep.
and that it was the outlier and the nominal percentage of people that really did game the system. But I also would expect that there will be some of that, and the state will have to pay that money back to the federal government. We're on the hook as taxpayers
Yeah.
for that money to Uncle Sam. And so all of that money will be audited by the Secretary of State's office, and it's going to be a huge task because it all moved out so quickly, not just the $35 million, but we have dedicated, I guess $200 million went to local governments for reimbursement outside of the metro area with
Right.
Washington, Multnomah, and Portland. And then we have $300 million in reserves. I mean, and the total amount that came into Oregon through that was about $1.6 billion.
Wow.
So that's a big investment of stimulus dollars into our state.
Yeah.
And the opportunity to make sure that it goes to entities that have appropriate accounting mechanisms in place, make sure there's no self-dealing. And there's a lot of challenges with getting money out at a state level that quickly. And that's what that is what the Secretary of State's office is for, is to help us with that.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. And I have kind of a follow-up to that one. Like we mentioned earlier, the legislature gave away the $500 to individuals who had not received all their unemployment and met income guidelines. Wouldn't those millions of dollars have been better spent fixing the unemployment computer system?
The unemployment computer system is the bane of my existence.
I'm sure you get lots of questions about
and
the unemployment
Oregonians
computer
across
system.
our state
Yeah.
who would have been better served if the employment department would have updated that system when they received the $90 million from the federal government years ago to do it.
Yeah.
That money's still sitting there. So the challenge for...
So it's not a funding issue.
It is not a funding issue. That's the challenge. The employment department today has the money to update, upgrade, and improve their computer system. The federal dollars that they were given back in 2017 or 2012 is still in an account waiting to be spent. And so it's leadership. It's a leadership challenge. And so if you look at the work for your team and you have record unemployment, which they've had for years now, you might say, we're not overwhelmed with employment claims right now. Let's do the next thing. Let's update our computer system. We have the money.
Yep.
We have some capacity. Let's invest in preparing. They chose not to do that. And now they're completely overwhelmed managing cases and just getting people their checks. And the checks are, they're weekly claims.
Right.
And so they might be completely caught up one week. And then the next week there's some glitches in the claims and there's some uncertainty whether or not people are still eligible, and everybody gets knotted up again, and then they get backlogged again. They could be on track one week, completely a mess the next. And so the employment department, I requested from them an accounting of how they are investing their IT time. Like, your computer folks, what are they focusing on?
Yeah.
If they're not upgrading the system, what are they doing? And they gave me their priorities for how they're investing their time. And some of those challenges for them right now, as you can imagine, it took some time for them to get the pandemic unemployment assistance up and running.
Right.
It's a new program.
Brand new program in the midst of
record claims
Yeah.
in the traditional program.
So some of this is kind of understandable.
Absolutely. Logistically. But hindsight 2020 and all that,
Right.
they had time, capacity, and money to upgrade their computer system in the last, 8 years, 5 years, didn't do it. And now they don't have the time to do it, but they still have the money. So it's not a funding issue, or I absolutely would have committed money to that effort.
Yeah.
The other part of that, the other reason why that $35 million probably couldn't go towards the computer system upgrade, is their projections for that project make it a multi-year project. That's how in-depth it is.
Right.
And the money from the CARES Act has to be spent by the end of the year, entirely expended by December 31.
Okay.
And so it could not realistically have probably gone for a multi-year project unless they could have shown actuarially that money was spent on the front end.
Yeah.
And so getting it out into the hands of Oregonians as quickly as we could was the decision that was made at that time.
Well, and I can only imagine, maybe a lot of people don't know much about government procurement and the RFP process and the vetting of the RFP
lengthy.
process. I mean, it's lengthy just to even get going. So in terms of those CARES dollars,
Yeah.
clock's ticking in
Yeah.
terms of
We're in September.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. 3 months to
3
turn around an
months.
RFP. Yeah. Yeah. You could maybe pay some consultancy fees
Yep.
in that time frame. Okay. All right. Basically, kind of last question. This one comes from one of our member businesses. They say, we are working really hard to keep up with all the regulations set out by the governor and by the dental association / community. We have purchased several expensive products to make our environment even better than before, and we were great before. We are rather frustrated by the inconsistencies we are seeing regarding regulations / mandates from the governor. For example, tattoo parlors are open for business, but not swimming pools. With that, they have this question in mind. As a business, we have followed and will continue following safety guidelines, including mandating masks. When can we get back to a normal schedule? Full statewide opening, including schools. If we are wearing the masks and if they are as effective as stated, shouldn't we be able to open the state?
Dun, 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 dun.
I know.
That's the big one.
Is this one to end on right here?
That's the biggest one, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Mm-hmm.
And this is why elections matter. This is why it matters who leads your state for this exact moment. Is we happen to have a very important question, which is a health question, that is dependent on the political judgment of someone who's elected. And that's where we're at. We don't have the luxury of being able to say that the governor has been clear with us up until now. I mean, this is new for everyone.
Right.
None of us were expecting this. And so the rules have changed as we've gone along, and the guidance has changed, and opportunities for input are varied for where you can really engage and know the decision is going to be made and know that's the moment to call the governor's office or call me.
Right.
And so I would love to have a clear answer to that.
Yeah.
I think Oregonians deserve some clarity.
Yeah.
But we don't have it right now.
Yeah.
And we have the governor we have, and she is operating in the way that she thinks is best for our state, I have to hope and assume good intent. And we aren't going to know when we can get back to normal, because she has said, because she's changed the goalposts, frankly. If this was just about making sure that our hospitals aren't overwhelmed, we would be moving at a different pace.
Yeah.
And instead, it's now about managing the existence of COVID in the state of Oregon when we're not an island and we can't just shut off airline traffic, and we have porous borders and all of those other good things. And so I wish I had a good answer for that.
Yeah.
The answer to that question, we should invite Governor Brown to come and sit with the chamber and see what she says. And
Absolutely.
so that is entirely at her personal discretion right now, because she has instituted emergency declarations which have no end. And those emergency declarations are not tied to a particular goal. And so we can't even claim that we've met the goal and then move forward. It is at her discretion.
Yeah.
And that is a tough place to be as a state right now. And I have people ask me all the time to just do something.
Yeah.
And the something that I can do is to communicate with her candidly on behalf of my community.
Yeah.
I do not pull any punches, and I'm really, really clear with her that we need clarity. You know, we need consistency, and we need her to pull with us.
Yeah.
We need her to care about what's going on in our families, in our businesses, and our communities in a way that allows us to have something to work toward.
Yeah. It does feel a little bit like, you know, we're trying to move forward, but people are at the front of the cart pulling one way, and people are at the back of the cart pulling one way, and we're kind of in a little bit of a no man's land. But you brought up something I think that was interesting, and I think it goes into kind of dealing with the governor and the emergency board and how decisions are made at this time. A lot of people wonder, how can they participate? How can they communicate? And when and how is that appropriate? And what are those avenues?
Communicate early and often.
Okay.
And the avenues are complicated.
Right.
So right now, the legislature in the last session, the presiding officers, the legislature's run by Democrats, one from Salem, one from Portland. They made the decision not to even hold public hearings. And so that meant that we moved legislation in the last session against the wishes of the majority of bipartisan members that thought that this was a bad idea. They moved legislation with no public testimony on it, no opportunity for amendment, and no one could propose legislation if you weren't the presiding officers. We went into session where every legislator except the presiding officers couldn't even draft legislation. That's unprecedented.
Right. That is the job.
That's the job. You create policy.
Right.
And so we have right now extraordinarily narrow control. So at a legislative side, you have control from the two presiding officers. Peter Courtney is the Senate president from Salem, and Tina Kotek is the Speaker of the House. She's from Portland. And they decide. They control the chambers right now. And then the governor decides on behalf of the governor. And so hers is all administrative, executive orders, all the mandates people are seeing, all the rule changes they're seeing, OSHA rules,
Right.
DEQ changes. They're talking about, they're moving forward with tolling, they're moving forward with cap and trade, they're moving forward with all of the traditional stuff that they were doing. It's all still moving. And so you still have to engage at an agency level, provide your public input. Don't miss deadlines. And that's what the chamber is important for. That's what staying in touch with my office is important for.
Yeah.
We push out Transparency Thursdays every Thursday and say, hey, did you know this was going on?
Yeah.
And
Beautiful.
and your office does an extraordinary job of making sure people know when opportunities for public input happen on issues that
tried.
affect business.
Yeah.
And so it is hard to track it all, but I think this is the takeaway from this moment, is it's better to reach out and share a concern regardless of whether or not you're under a deadline,
Yeah.
than for people to not know something's going on. And so I would say emergency board in particular is an entity that's been given a lot of authority for spending money right now. And by spending money, they're setting policy.
Right.
Because budgets reflect priorities. And when you spend money, you are investing in a government activity you want to see occur. So we have $300 million, $200 million, $300 million in the emergency board right now, which is a record amount of money for that body. It's a committee, but it's a committee that meets without public input. It's a committee that can meet with notice of less than 24 hours. And all of a sudden they're posted and they say, we're going to spend $300 million today. And on these things, on these 10 things that the presiding officers have chosen in consultation with the governor. And there's no opportunity for the public to even comment.
Right.
And so
So it exists outside of what is the rule about the notice of public meeting?
It is, well, I think technically they try to hit the 24-hour meeting to say the meeting's going to happen.
Okay.
But there's no requirement for you to know what is on the agenda
Oh, wow.
until right before the meeting. And so they'll post 24 hours and say, e-board's going to meet tomorrow, but you have no idea
Right.
what the content of that meeting is going to include. And so I'm on e-board, I'm in leadership, communicate with me. I will continue to do my best to communicate out through newsletters
Yeah.
and websites and everything else I can. But when you have consolidated power like this, and when you have a crisis, sometimes people use the crisis as an excuse to be expedient and say that the real value here is expedience. No, the real value here is strong public policy that engages a concerned citizenry that's impacted.
Yes.
That's always the real value,
Right.
whether you like what they're going to say or not.
Mm-hmm.
We have to reach out. We have to let people know, because one size doesn't fit all.
Yep.
And right now we're very Portland driven. There's a legislator in the building that kind of rails all the time against this idea, and she calls it PGE, and she says Portland gets everything. And she's not wrong.
I'm sure PGE doesn't love that acronym.
I know. And PGE understands it's no reflection on them.
Right.
But the point becomes, with this narrow focus control, there's a tendency to be responsive to the urban centers.
Right.
And it's really, really important for the suburbs and the rural communities of our state to communicate early and often, because they're not always in the room.
Yeah.
And I'll be in the room and carry that message all day long. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
But we have to consistently communicate and say, you need to fully understand the consequences of this decision. This is who you're leaving out of this discussion.
Right.
You need to know
Who's not at the table.
who's not at the table or who you've intentionally excluded.
Yep.
You just need to know that. And then the democratic process moves forward. We vote, and majority rules. And I've got that's the way our system works. That's okay.
Yeah.
But we can't cut out the part of the process that legislatively has a rich history of engaging the public, because that supports the strongest, best use of funds and the strongest, best development of public policy. And so if we have at every single e-board meeting, I say to Senator Courtney, we need to change how e-board operates. If we're going to be the body that makes these decisions, we have to change our traditions. E-board has to take public testimony. You can't just take agency testimony. that's got to be a thing of the past.
Yeah.
It's too important right now.
Right.
So
Well, we
we're
appreciate
working on
that.
it.
Yeah, we appreciate that endeavor and that
Mm-hmm.
you inserting that point into the conversation.
yeah, there's
Yeah.
a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
And we cannot do it in a vacuum.
No. Well, I appreciate all of your efforts and your time here today.
So good to
answering
see you
our questions.
again.
Yes, absolutely. So, who knows what the future may bring? We might sit right back down at this table here in a couple months' time and
Yeah.
have a whole wealth of new questions.
We
to
shall
answer.
see. It'll be fun when we sit down at this table and we're somehow on the other side.
Yeah. Do you have any last messages for folks? I know, November.
November is coming.
Is coming.
Yes, it's an election year.
Yeah.
It's an election year, and I am on the ballot, and we've got great candidates on the ballot across
Yeah.
the state. And you get the government you vote for.
Mm-hmm.
You get and you get the outcomes you fight for.
Right.
And so it has been an absolute privilege in these last 2 years to serve this district and this community. It's been an education.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just been such a privilege to be able to stand in the room and do everything I can to reflect the needs of this area, which are not Portland and they're not the coast. We're uniquely situated here on the edge of the metro area.
Yeah.
And so it's been a privilege, and I look forward to the opportunity to earning people's support again and serving another term and continuing the good fight.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We appreciate all your efforts.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody for joining us today for another virtual luncheon with the Cambria Area Chamber of Commerce. Be well and reach out if you need anything from the Chamber.